The skies darkened as massive ships tore through the atmosphere, their sleek, alien hulls reflecting the fading sunlight. The Vraxian fleet had arrived, its presence undeniable and terrifying. The world held its breath as the first wave of invaders descended onto Earth, their advanced weaponry easily disabling satellites and communication networks, leaving humanity in a state of chaos and uncertainty. Across the globe, cities were plunged into darkness, and people fled into the streets in blind panic. Governments scrambled to organize a response, but it was clear that Earth was completely unprepared for this invasion. The Vraxians, however, had no intention of negotiating or seeking peace. For them, conquest was an instinct, a way of life. Their species had wiped out countless civilizations across the galaxy, and Earth was just another challenge to conquer, another planet to add to their ever-growing list of trophies. They believed themselves to be the ultimate predators, warlike, ruthless, and unstoppable. Their leader, Commander Zarklor, stood at the helm of the invasion, a towering figure clad in black armor, his eyes cold and calculating. He had witnessed the destruction of many worlds, and Earth would be no different. "Prepare the ground forces," Zarklor ordered, his voice echoing in the command center. Let them feel the might of the Vraxian army. The Vraxians' primary method of warfare was simple, overwhelming firepower. Their ships could unleash devastating blasts that could obliterate entire cities in seconds. Their foot soldiers were engineered for combat, strong, fast, and relentless. They had no need for diplomacy or subtlety. They saw no reason to engage in complex negotiations with a species they deemed inferior. Within hours, major cities across the world were under attack. In New York, the iconic skyline was marred by the looming presence of a Vraxian dreadnought. Its shadow blocked out the sun, casting a pall over the streets below. As the first wave of Vraxian ground troops landed, they tore through military defenses with little effort. Tanks were reduced to rubble, and soldiers were cut down by energy blasts before they even had a chance to fire their weapons. The people of Earth watched in horror as the invaders swept through their cities, leaving a wake of destruction in their path. In other parts of the world, similar scenes unfolded. In Moscow, Vraxian forces surrounded the Kremlin, destroying everything in their path. In Beijing, the Great Wall crumbled under the force of Vraxian artillery, and civilians were forced to flee or face annihilation. The message was clear. Humanity was powerless, their technology primitive, and their defenses laughable. Yet, despite the terror and devastation, something unexpected began to stir among the human survivors. As the Vraxians roamed the streets, confident in their victory, a strange feeling began to rise, a flicker of defiance, of resistance, of something more than just fear. It was a spark of humanity's spirit that the invaders had not anticipated. They had come expecting easy prey, but what they found was far more complicated. In the heart of London, a group of civilians barricaded themselves in a subway station. They were terrified, but there was something about the look in their eyes, a determination that had not been there before. It was a look that spread to others as well. From the underground resistance in Paris to the improvised militias in Johannesburg, humans were beginning to fight back, using whatever they had at their disposal. But the Vraxians didn't notice. They were too focused on their conquest, too confident in their superiority. The predators believed that no one could possibly stand in their way. And yet, as the fires of resistance began to burn across Earth, one thing became clear. Humanity was not ready to go down without a fight. The Vraxians believed they had Earth under their control. With their overwhelming firepower and superior technology, they swept through major cities like a storm, crushing all in their path. Yet, amid the chaos, something began to shift. The predators had underestimated humanity's ability to survive. What they didn't account for was the human spirit, a force that could not be easily crushed, no matter how dire the situation. In the rubble of once thriving cities, humans were starting to organize. What began as small pockets of resistance, composed of civilians and scattered soldiers, quickly evolved into a more coordinated and dangerous movement. They may have lacked the advanced technology of the Vraxians, but what they did have was resourcefulness, ingenuity, and the will to fight for their survival. A group of military personnel in the ruins of New York City began to form a plan. Lieutenant Sarah Grant, an experienced officer, quickly emerged as the leader of a small resistance cell. She gathered a team of soldiers and civilians alike, all willing to risk their lives to strike back at the invaders. They didn't have the high-tech weapons the Vraxians wielded, but they had something far more valuable: knowledge of the city's layout, familiarity with the underground tunnels, and the element of surprise. Under Grant's leadership, the group began carrying out small-scale sabotage operations against the Vraxian forces. Their first strike was against a Vraxian supply convoy moving through the city, loaded with weapons and reinforcements. Using homemade explosives and makeshift traps, they ambushed the convoy. The Vraxians were caught off guard. The ambush was not a victory on the scale of what the invaders had achieved, but it was enough to send a message. Humanity would not bow without a fight. Around the world, similar pockets of resistance were forming. In Paris, a small group of engineers and tech specialists infiltrated a Vraxian communication center. They used their expertise to hack into the invaders' systems, disabling their security and sending false signals to distract their forces. In the deserts of Arizona, a ragtag group of hunters and ex-soldiers had set up guerrilla hideouts where they used their knowledge of the land to launch surprise attacks on Vraxian patrols. Despite the overwhelming odds, humans refused to yield. They fought back with a vengeance, using the resources available to them. Where the Vraxians relied on brute force, humans used strategy and adaptability. As one resistance fighter, a former teacher from Chicago, put it, "They may have the firepower, but we have the mind to outsmart them." Even though these victories were small, they started to have an effect. The Vraxian invaders, who had been so certain of their easy conquest, were beginning to feel the pressure. Commander Zarklor, the Vraxian leader, watched his forces struggle to contain the growing resistance. Each time a human cell launched an attack, it threw off the Vraxians' plans and cost them valuable resources. It was clear that the Vraxians had misjudged humanity. They thought humans would cower in fear, waiting to be hunted down. Instead, humans were beginning to push back, not just in isolated skirmishes, but in a rising wave of defiance. The predators were starting to realize that they weren't just facing a prey species. They were facing a species capable of fighting back, of adapting, and of turning the tables. The Vraxian strategy of swift, overwhelming attacks faltered as the resistance grew. Zarklor and his commanders were forced to shift tactics, but even they could not predict the persistence of the humans. The once confident invaders were now caught in a battle they hadn't expected, one where their superior technology didn't guarantee victory. And for the humans, the fight was just beginning. They knew it wasn't going to be easy. The Vraxians were relentless, and the odds were still heavily stacked against them. But with each small victory, the resistance grew stronger. They had found their first taste of success, and it was enough to fuel their hope. The Vraxians may have thought they were the hunters, but the humans were proving that they could be predators too. The tide of the war had shifted. What the Vraxians believed to be a simple conquest had turned into an unrelenting struggle. Commander Zarklor's forces, once brimming with arrogance, were now stretched thin, caught off guard by the resourcefulness and creativity of the humans they had deemed insignificant. What the Vraxians had failed to understand was that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their technology. It was in their ability to adapt, to improvise, and to think outside the box. In hidden bunkers and abandoned buildings, human engineers and technicians had begun working tirelessly to reverse engineer Vraxian technology. With only scraps of alien technology and the most basic tools, they created makeshift devices that allowed them to fight back in ways the Vraxians had never anticipated. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when a group of engineers in the ruins of Boston managed to crack the Vraxians' communication network. The humans, led by a brilliant tech specialist named Omar, were able to intercept and decode the alien transmissions. What followed was a series of successful attacks as they began to send false orders to the Vraxian forces, creating confusion and chaos within their ranks. Meanwhile, in California, a small group of former military strategists, now fighting as part of a civilian militia, devised an ingenious plan to disrupt the Vraxians' supply chain. They discovered that the Vraxians, despite their superior technology, relied on massive convoys to transport essential materials and reinforcements. Using their knowledge of the terrain and guerrilla tactics, the humans set up ambushes along key roads, taking out supply trucks and cutting off the invaders' vital resources. These attacks were precise and relentless, striking at the heart of the Vraxians' logistics and crippling their ability to maintain control. In South America, the resistance had started to build a network of underground bunkers where civilians, soldiers, and scientists worked side by side. They repurposed old vehicles and weapons, making them more efficient in combat situations. A group of farmers, previously unaware of military strategy, had even started to use their knowledge of agriculture to create makeshift bombs from fertilizers and chemicals, an unexpected weapon that would cause widespread destruction to Vraxian forces. But it wasn't just their technological ingenuity that made humans dangerous. It was their ability to come together, regardless of background or profession, and form a united front. In the heart of London, a diverse group of resistance fighters, from former police officers to artists, collaborated to sabotage Vraxian supply depots. They used their knowledge of the city's underground infrastructure, setting traps and ambushing patrols at night. It wasn't the power of advanced technology that made their efforts successful. It was their unity and determination to fight for their future. Even in the worst-hit areas, humans were showing an uncanny ability to adapt to their environment. In the ruins of New York, survivors had started to use old subway tunnels as hidden paths to move undetected. They built makeshift weapons, everything from sharpened pikes to improvised explosives, and launched surprise attacks against unsuspecting Vraxian patrols. The invaders, still arrogant in their belief that Earth was theirs for the taking, had no idea that every human left on the planet was becoming more and more capable of resisting their control. The Vraxians, once certain of their dominance, now found themselves in a constant state of vigilance. Each new human tactic seemed more unpredictable and clever than the last. They couldn't rely on brute force alone anymore. Humanity had begun to turn the very things that had once seemed like weaknesses into advantages. It wasn't just that the humans were surviving. They were adapting, evolving, and proving that they could outthink their predators. Zarklor, watching from his command ship in orbit, felt the first stirrings of doubt. His forces, once invincible, were beginning to lose ground. The Vraxians had underestimated humanity's resilience, and now they were paying the price. The humans' ability to adapt, to improvise, was something the Vraxians had never encountered before, and it was starting to feel like a war of attrition that they couldn't easily win. As the humans continued to innovate and adapt, their morale surged. They realized that they didn't need to match the Vraxians in firepower. They only needed to be cleverer, more resourceful, and unyielding. They had discovered the power of their own ingenuity, and it was a weapon far more potent than anything the Vraxians could have anticipated. Commander Zarklor stood in the dimly lit war room aboard the Vraxian flagship, watching the tactical reports come in. His brow furrowed as he surveyed the data. Despite their technological superiority and relentless assault, the Vraxians were not achieving the swift and complete victory they had anticipated. The human resistance, though still scattered, had begun to show an unsettling level of organization and resolve. At first, Zarklor had dismissed the occasional sabotage and minor ambushes as the last desperate gasps of a dying species. He had seen such acts of defiance countless times before on worlds too weak to fight back. But this was different. These humans, despite being outmatched and outgunned, were proving more resilient than any species he had encountered. Their attacks were becoming more coordinated, their tactics more sophisticated. The resistance was growing, and their victories, though small, were beginning to accumulate. What is this madness? Zarklor muttered under his breath as another report of a successful human strike flickered on the screen. A critical Vraxian communications tower had been taken down in Beijing. Another convoy had been ambushed in the Middle East. Despite the overwhelming firepower of the Vraxian forces, these humans were not breaking. They were adapting, and it was making the Vraxians' job far more difficult than it should have been. You were told to crush them quickly, Zarklor. The voice of his second-in-command, Tarksha, cut through his thoughts. Why has this resistance persisted? Zarklor turned to face Tarksha. His eyes narrowed. The humans are far more resourceful than we gave them credit for, he admitted, his pride wounded by the admission. They have begun to exploit every advantage they can find, no matter how small. Tarksha shifted uneasily. But their technology, it's primitive compared to ours. They shouldn't be able to stand against us for long. That's what I thought, Zarklor growled. But somehow, they're managing. They are using their terrain, their knowledge, and their ability to improvise. They don't need our technology. They are turning their weakness into strength. The Vraxian leader clenched his fists, frustration building. They had underestimated humanity in every way. They had seen Earth as a low-level conquest, a planet ripe for the taking. What they hadn't counted on was the indomitable human spirit, the will to fight, the refusal to surrender. Meanwhile, the human resistance was growing more audacious by the day. In the dark corners of every occupied city, small cells of resistance fighters were communicating, planning, and launching bolder strikes. They were no longer simply fighting to survive. They were fighting to win. It became clear that humanity had found something inside itself, a raw, unyielding willpower that was proving to be a far more dangerous weapon than the Vraxians had predicted. Lieutenant Sarah Grant, now a key figure in the New York resistance, led a successful strike against a Vraxian supply depot. Her team had infiltrated the heavily guarded facility using the city's abandoned subway tunnels, planting explosives in key locations. The explosion that followed decimated the Vraxian supplies, crippling their efforts to resupply their forces. The strike not only caused significant damage, but sent a powerful message. Earth was not going to be an easy conquest. Back in Europe, similar actions were unfolding. In Paris, a coordinated attack on a Vraxian command center crippled their strategic operations in Western Europe. The resistance fighters had used the city's old catacombs to approach undetected, setting up explosive traps along the Vraxian patrol routes. The attack was a major blow to the Vraxians' leadership, and for the first time, Zarklor had to admit that the humans were becoming a force to be reckoned with. The resistance had learned a crucial lesson. They didn't need to win every battle to succeed. Every small victory chipped away at the Vraxians' confidence, weakening their grip on Earth. More humans were joining the fight every day, inspired by the successes of their fellow survivors. The resistance wasn't just surviving anymore. They were actively pushing back, destabilizing the Vraxian forces, and causing the once-feared invaders to question their dominance. Zarklor watched the data stream on his terminal, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. The Vraxians had thought they were hunting prey, but in truth, they were facing a species that would not bend, would not break, and would not surrender. The Vraxians had miscalculated. They had underestimated the very thing that made humans dangerous: their will to survive, to protect their home, and to fight for their future. The invaders had come to Earth believing they were the hunters, but the humans had shown them that they were not prey. They were predators in their own right, and the Vraxians had underestimated the consequences of that. The momentum of the war was shifting in ways that Commander Zarklor could no longer ignore. The Vraxians, once certain of their ultimate victory, were now beginning to face a slow and painful retreat. They had come to Earth expecting a swift conquest, but instead they were becoming entangled in a conflict that was quickly draining their resources and morale. Zarklor paced the command deck of his flagship, a dark storm brewing in his chest. His once confident demeanor had faltered. The relentless attacks from the human resistance were having an undeniable impact. Each new offensive launched by humanity, though modest in scale, was causing more damage to the Vraxian war effort. The humans, it seemed, had found ways to strike at the very heart of the Vraxian invasion. "We must adapt, or we risk losing everything," Zarklor muttered, his voice low and full of frustration. "These humans are unlike any species we've encountered before. They fight like cornered animals, but they're no longer just defending themselves. They're pushing us back." Tarksha, ever the loyal second in command, stood silently at Zarklor's side. "What do you suggest, Commander? We could launch a more decisive strike, but our resources are stretched thin. The human resistance is using guerrilla tactics that we're not prepared for." Zarklor's eyes narrowed as he stared out at the view of Earth below. The planet, once so full of promise for conquest, now appeared more like a battleground. The once dominant Vraxian fleet, which had effortlessly swept through countless worlds, was now struggling to maintain its foothold on Earth. "You are right," Zarklor said. "Our forces are becoming too spread out. We underestimated the resilience of these humans. They have turned their own home ground into a deadly weapon. We must pull back and regroup." The decision to retreat was not one Zarklor made lightly. For a race like the Vraxians, retreat was seen as a sign of weakness, something that could demoralize the entire fleet and undermine their confidence. But there was no choice. The Vraxians had lost too many resources, too many soldiers, and the fight was no longer in their favor. It was a painful but necessary decision. Across the globe, the effects of the Vraxian retreat were becoming evident. The humans, emboldened by their small but significant victories, began to see a shift in their favor. The Vraxian forces were pulling back from key cities, their supply lines disrupted, and their once unmatched technological advantage suddenly vulnerable. It was as if the humans had become a swarm of bees, relentless and precise, picking apart their would-be conquerors piece by piece. In New York, Lieutenant Sarah Grant's resistance cell received word that a major Vraxian base on the outskirts of the city was being evacuated. The opportunity to strike was too great to ignore. With minimal resources and a small but determined force, they quickly mobilized to sabotage the Vraxian retreat. Using their knowledge of the city's infrastructure and the element of surprise, they launched a precision strike against the fleeing forces. The attack was swift and brutal. The human fighters, using the city's labyrinth of tunnels and rooftops, caught the Vraxians off guard. They disabled transport vehicles, set explosive charges along key routes, and cut off any chance of an organized retreat. The Vraxians, still reeling from their earlier defeats, had no response. The humans were no longer simply reacting to the invaders. They were dictating the pace of the war. Even in other parts of the world, the resistance was organizing to exploit the Vraxian retreat. In the mountains of Central Asia, resistance fighters began to strike at isolated Vraxian outposts, taking advantage of the invaders' weakened position. In South America, a massive coordinated attack was launched on a Vraxian supply depot. The humans, once scattered and disorganized, were now operating with a level of coordination and precision that rivaled any military force on Earth. The Vraxian fleet, despite its technological superiority, was beginning to look vulnerable. Zarklor knew that his forces were on the brink of collapse if they didn't act quickly. The humans had gained the upper hand in the war, and each victory they secured made it more difficult for the Vraxians to regain control. The predators had become the prey. Despite the enemy's growing resistance, Zarklor was not one to admit defeat easily. As the Vraxian fleet retreated to regroup in orbit, he made one final decision. "We will not abandon this world. The humans may have won a few battles, but they are far from victory. We will return, and when we do, we will crush them once and for all." Yet even as he spoke those words, there was a lingering doubt in his mind. The humans had proven themselves to be far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. They had the will to fight, the ingenuity to adapt, and the spirit to survive. The Vraxians had underestimated them from the very beginning, and it might cost them more than just this battle. As the Vraxian forces retreated to their ships, leaving behind the once dominant ground forces, Earth's resistance grew stronger. The war was far from over, but for the first time since the invasion began, there was a glimmer of hope. Humanity had not only survived, they had made the predators retreat. The Vraxians' retreat, though a temporary reprieve, had ignited something within humanity. It wasn't just hope. It was a burning desire for victory. The resistance that had once been a loose collection of scattered groups had transformed into a unified force. Each victory, no matter how small, fueled their determination. The Vraxians might have underestimated them, but the humans had proven one undeniable truth. They would not go quietly into the night. In the aftermath of the retreat, the human resistance didn't pause to catch their breath. They had tasted success, and now they were hungry for more. Across the world, resistance cells worked in tandem, their coordination a testament to how far humanity had come in such a short time. Lieutenant Sarah Grant, who had been instrumental in leading the charge in New York, was now in command of a growing army of fighters, engineers, and tacticians, all of whom were driven by one singular goal: to push the Vraxians off Earth for good. Grant, standing in front of a map covered in red markers indicating Vraxian strongholds, addressed her team. "We've done more than survive. We've hurt them. And now we take the fight to them. We've been reacting long enough. It's time to take the offensive." Her words were met with nods of agreement. The time for waiting was over. The humans, having once been scattered and fragmented, were now an organized force with the will and determination to drive the invaders from their planet. While the leadership of the resistance moved forward with battle plans, the rest of the world was waking up to a new reality. No longer were the Vraxians seen as invincible conquerors. They were perceived as vulnerable invaders whose dominance had been shattered. The human spirit was resilient, and that resilience had become a powerful force. Ordinary civilians, once content with surviving, now joined the fight. Factories, once producing consumer goods, were retooled to manufacture weapons and supplies for the growing resistance. As the Vraxian forces continued to regroup, they had failed to anticipate the sheer scale of the resistance's mobilization. Tsar Chlor, still reeling from the earlier defeats, knew that he could no longer treat Earth as just another conquest. The humans were no longer the prey they had once thought them to be. They had become the hunters. But the Vraxians, with their technological superiority, still held an edge. However, it was clear now that their strength alone wouldn't be enough to secure victory. On the front lines, the resistance launched coordinated strikes across multiple continents. In Europe, fighters equipped with stolen Vraxian tech attacked major outposts, disabling weapons systems and dismantling communication relays. In the Middle East, guerrilla units hit supply lines with pinpoint accuracy, leaving the Vraxians isolated and vulnerable. And in the heart of Africa, the resistance, united for the first time under a central command, launched a series of ambushes that crippled the Vraxian presence on the continent. It was the biggest coordinated offensive Earth had ever seen. The Vraxians were being pushed back, and the resistance was relentless. The humans, with all their ingenuity, used the land to their advantage. Forests became traps, mountains became fortresses, and cities became battlegrounds where every corner hid a deadly surprise. In the skies, the Vraxian ships, once a symbol of overwhelming power, began to retreat from major cities. Their once fearsome fleet was now a broken shadow of its former self. Humans, in their determination to reclaim their planet, had learned to target the weaknesses of their invaders. They no longer hid in the shadows. They came out with force, using every tool at their disposal. What had once been a small resistance now resembled an army that was giving the Vraxians a fight unlike any they had ever encountered. Tsar Chlor stood on his flagship, watching as reports from his commanders came in. His forces were in disarray, unable to handle the combined might of the humans. What had been a strategic retreat was now becoming a rout. The once proud invaders were being driven back, their forces scattering in the face of humanity's tenacity. He slammed his fist onto the control panel in frustration. We have underestimated them. We must regroup and strike with everything we have left. But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his mind. The humans had not only survived, they had learned, adapted, and grown stronger. They had taken the fight to the Vraxians in ways that were impossible to predict. And now, they were on the verge of delivering a blow that could break the invaders once and for all. The humans were no longer just resisting. They were winning. They were taking the fight to the Vraxians, and the invaders, once sure of their inevitable victory, now had to face the possibility that Earth was no longer theirs to conquer. The war, once thought unwinnable by humanity, had reached a critical juncture. The Vraxians, who had initially flooded Earth with overwhelming force, were now on the defensive, reeling from a series of catastrophic setbacks. Every victory the humans claimed seemed to snowball into another, each new attack emboldening resistance forces across the globe. The Vraxians' technological might, while formidable, was no match for the ingenuity and relentless drive of humanity. Commander Zarklor, standing on the command bridge of his flagship, watched as his fleet's communication lines began to flicker with signs of disarray. His once loyal commanders had begun sending in reports of retreating troops, with no clear plan for regrouping. The humans had forced the Vraxians to fight not just on the front lines, but in their very supply chains, on the streets of cities, and deep within the planet's wilderness. What had started as an invasion had turned into an exhausting war of attrition, with the humans proving to be far more formidable than the Vraxians had ever anticipated. "We cannot continue like this," Zarklor muttered, his hands clenched into fists. "Our forces are stretched too thin. We need reinforcements from the homeworld, or this will be our undoing." But even as he spoke, Zarklor knew reinforcements would not change the outcome. The Vraxian fleet, once the harbinger of destruction, had failed to maintain control. The humans had turned the tables, pushing them back at every opportunity. Their tactics were unpredictable, their strikes calculated, and their morale was unshakable. For the first time, Zarklor feared defeat. On the ground, the resistance pressed on, knowing they were mere steps from victory. Lieutenant Sarah Grant, who had grown from a reluctant leader to a symbol of human resilience, had received orders to launch the final offensive. The last major Vraxian stronghold on Earth, a heavily fortified complex in the heart of what was once Washington, D.C., remained the invaders' last foothold. This was their last chance to regain control of the planet. If it fell, the Vraxians would be forced to abandon Earth entirely. Grant, along with her most trusted commanders, gathered in a makeshift war room, studying the map of the city. She looked up, meeting the eyes of each of her officers. "This is it. We've come too far to fail now. The Vraxians are on the brink of collapse, and this strike will be the final blow. Our forces are ready. We know the layout of their defenses. This is our chance to end this once and for all." The team nodded, their faces set with determination. For years, they had fought to simply survive, to resist the Vraxians' relentless assault. But now, they weren't just resisting. They were taking back their world. They were going to show the invaders what true humanity was capable of. As the final push began, the resistance fighters surged into action. Coordinated across continents, a massive multi-pronged assault targeted the Vraxian stronghold from all directions. In Washington, D.C., a special task force, led by Grant herself, infiltrated the heart of the enemy base. Using the underground metro tunnels that had become their secret lifeline, they bypassed Vraxian patrols and planted explosives on key structural points designed to cripple the alien infrastructure. The battle raged throughout the city. The Vraxian defenses, though still formidable, were now spread too thin to withstand the combined might of humanity's offensive. What had once been a well-oiled war machine was now a disorganized retreating force, caught off guard by the humans' ability to strike where they were least expected. In the skies above, the Vraxian fleet, still attempting to regroup, found themselves under constant attack by human fighters using repurposed Vraxian technology. The once proud ships, capable of devastating any planet, were now outmaneuvered by the resourceful humans, whose fighters were equipped with hybrid weaponry. Vraxian tech melded with human ingenuity. The Vraxian ships faltered under the pressure, their advanced shields unable to handle the unpredictable tactics of their enemies. Commander Zarklor, now watching from orbit, was forced to acknowledge the inevitable. His forces were being overwhelmed. His fleet was crippled. The ground was lost. And Earth, once a prize waiting to be claimed, was slipping from his grasp. He turned to his officers. "Prepare the fleet for full retreat. There's nothing more we can do here." But even as he gave the order, there was a part of him that still couldn't believe it was over. The Vraxians had lost battles before, but never like this. Never had they faced an enemy who could match their technological superiority with such relentless innovation, such raw tenacity. The humans, despite their apparent weaknesses, had fought with the heart of warriors who would never surrender. Back in Washington, D.C., as the final explosions rocked the Vraxian stronghold, Lieutenant Grant and her team stood at the epicenter of victory. The war was not over, but they had just secured humanity's greatest triumph. Earth was no longer under the shadow of the Vraxians. The invaders had been driven from their world, and the humans had proven to themselves and the galaxy that they were not to be underestimated. The resistance had become more than just a fight for survival. It was a declaration. Humanity was no longer prey. They were predators in their own right, and the universe would never forget the lesson they had taught the Vraxians. The sound of distant explosions echoed through the streets of Washington, D.C. as the final battle raged on. Humanity had pushed the Vraxians to the brink of collapse, but they weren't about to let their homes slip through their fingers now. This was the moment they had been fighting for, the moment when Earth's fate would be sealed, and the invaders would be driven off for good. Lieutenant Sarah Grant, her face smeared with dirt and sweat, stood at the head of the final assault team. Her eyes were focused on the Vraxian stronghold ahead, once a symbol of the invaders' dominance, now reduced to a crumbling fortress on the edge of total collapse. The resistance fighters had surrounded it, and it was only a matter of time before the final detonations would bring it to its knees. "Almost there," Grant said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the battle. "Stay sharp. The Vraxians are desperate. We've broken their command structure, but we still need to finish this. No one lets up." Her team nodded in unison. Every soldier, every fighter, knew what was at stake. They weren't just fighting for the survival of their species. They were fighting for the future of Earth itself. The entire world was watching as humanity stood on the precipice of its greatest victory. Above them, the sky was filled with the remnants of the Vraxian fleet, retreating into the black void of space. The battle in orbit had been fierce, with human fighters using the last of their stolen Vraxian technology to outmaneuver the invaders. The Vraxians had failed to hold their position, their ships now scattered, fleeing to the edges of the solar system. Earth had become a battleground, and the humans had fought for every inch of their world. Now the final push was here. In the heart of the Vraxian stronghold, Commander Zarklor stood, watching the tactical displays flicker with reports of his fleet's disarray. His forces were shattered, his defenses breached. The humans had managed to infiltrate and sabotage every crucial system. Earth had become their graveyard, a place where the Vraxians had underestimated their prey and now paid the price for their arrogance. Zarklor's hands clenched into fists. He knew that no reinforcements were coming. His remaining troops were scattered, leaderless, and on the verge of retreat. The human resistance, now unified and relentless, had broken their ranks. His pride, his entire species' pride, had been shattered by the sheer determination of these humans. It was no longer a matter of whether they would win. It was a matter of when the final strike would come. "Commander," Tarksha's voice broke through his thoughts. "We can still make a last stand. We can take the fight to them and—" Zarklor's sharp glare silenced her. "No," he said, his voice cold and final. "We are finished. We failed. We will not dishonor ourselves further by fighting a battle we can no longer win. It's over." Zarklor turned his back on the battlefield. Prepare the fleet for final withdrawal. We are leaving Earth, and we are never coming back." As the Vraxian fleet began its retreat from Earth's orbit, the humans below knew that their final victory was within reach. The resistance fighters had breached the stronghold's last line of defense. It was a matter of moments before the core of the alien base would be destroyed, ensuring that the Vraxians had no way to regroup or launch another attack. Grant's team made their way through the wreckage of the Vraxian stronghold, planting the final charges. The alien structures groaned as explosions reverberated through the walls. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the once imposing fortress began to collapse. The Vraxian occupation was over. With one final glance at the shattered remains of the stronghold, Grant spoke into her comms. "It's done. We've won." The cheers from the other resistance fighters were deafening, echoing through the comm channels. The fight was over. The Vraxians had been driven from Earth. For the first time in years, the human race was free. Across the globe, people celebrated. The skies above the cities were no longer filled with the ominous hum of Vraxian ships, but with the roar of human jets and fireworks. The Vraxians, once sure of their dominance, had learned the hard way that Earth was not a world to be conquered. It was a world to be defended. Commander Zarklor, aboard his retreating flagship, looked back at Earth for the final time. The humans had been victorious. He had no illusions of returning to finish what had been started. Earth, with its fighting spirit and its fierce defenders, had proven one irrefutable truth. Humanity would never be anyone's prey. They were the predators now, and the universe would never forget the price of underestimating them. As the Vraxian fleet disappeared into the depths of space, Earth began its long recovery, its people forever changed by the battle they had fought and won. The war was over, but the story of humanity's survival, strength, and victory would be remembered for generations to come. And somewhere, in the vastness of space, the other civilizations watching Earth's struggle would understand one thing. Never again would they mistake humanity for prey.